I want to welcome all of you to our October Alliance program, and I want to particularly welcome Sally, who has agreed to put on this very interesting presentation for us. Sally Sennott is a graduate of Duke University and has lived in Belmont for 5 years. She's a retired newspaper correspondent, and she was the editor of a history museum newsletter. Sally has written two plays as well as a children's story that was produced into videos and featured on the Athol Cable Access Channel, ADTV. During COVID, uh, Kathy Sennott finished her, Sally Sennott finished her 60,000 word memoir, The Strong Man's Wife. That sounds interesting. And it's my pleasure that I'll turn the program today over to Sally Sennott, today's presenter. Thank you, Sally.
Okay, Women Matter. I took this picture at an abortion rally at Franklin Park in Boston in 2022. Healthcare matters. Maura Healey, now the governor of Massachusetts, spoke. I first heard the phrase abortion cares healthcare. As you know, I'm a feminist and women matter to me. White women, trans women, indigenous women, black and brown women. We're having a few slides to acclimate with my maternal lineage, going back 10 generations. Phineas Tyler is at the top. He was born in 1736, and his wife, Elizabeth Barker, was born in 1747. This information was gleaned from a book on the Tyler family in the Yale University Library that had been digitized and put on the internet. I thought at first that Tyler was a common name. Only later did I realize that John Tyler had been a U.S. president, and that was probably why I was able to find out about Elizabeth Barker because a book had been written about the Tyler family. Their child, Elizabeth Betsy Tyler, she married Asaph, which was a new name to me, Spalding in 1801. And one of their children, Sophia Spalding, was born in 1803. And her sister, Melora Spalding, was born in 1808. Melora is the mother of the person that we're going to be meeting today. Now, this is an election year, so I've sort of put an election theme in the presentation. In 1803, Sophia Spalding was born. This was right around the time, 1804 to be precise, when the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It specified that the vice president would not become the interim president if anything happened to the main person, the president. The line of succession was set for the circumstance of the president dying. The vice president would exercise the full powers of the president. That was the 12th Amendment. Now, Mima, the person that we're going to be talking a lot about today, sorry. Um, Mima was born in 1841. I'll see if I can see her. Her real name was Myra Elizabeth Claflin, and she was born in 1841. I did cross that out and put 1843 because in the newspaper it said that she was born in 1843, but on her tombstone it says 1841. So I believe 1841 is the correct date. Going back these generations, all the information is not always precise. Uh, so she was born in 1841, and John Tyler, the vice president of the United States, became president in 1841 when William Henry Harrison died. Now, before we leave this slide, which kind of gives a worldview and overview of the 5th through 10th generations, I want to point out the men. Phineas Tyler, Asaph Spalding, Luke Woodbury, I've got to find Zimri Bowen. I can. Zimri, that's an unusual name, Zimri. We'll be hearing his name again. And finally, at the bottom, David Corkum, my great grandfather. So we're back to 1859. So that gives you a little background. It's sort of like reading a Tolstoy novel. There are so many names that I thought it would be helpful to go over them a little bit. So the goals of the presentation are to talk about my origin story, to learn about the lives of women in the previous 3 centuries, to put my great-great-grandmother, M.E., standing for Myra Elizabeth Claflin Bowen's life in context, to trace feminism and entrepreneurship, to center the role of property, the generational wealth that is so much talked about today, specifically 54 Main Street, Leominster, Mass. And finally, but very important is to recognize the importance of what women knew and to not put too a low a value on it. Finally, we're at the title slide. Here's the working title, Meeting Mima and Her Aunt Sophia. But the global title is The Power of Our Origins. And I think the general genealogy, broad worldview is important, but we're going to be talking about it specifically in regard to Mima and her Aunt Sophia. Here is Mima Bowen. There are no pics of Sophia born in 1803 before the camera was invented. You'll notice that she's wearing a bow in her hair. We're going to be talking a lot about hats in this presentation. The daguerreotype was first shown in 1839, of course, invented in France. And it wasn't until the 1860s and the Civil War that photography was widespread. Here is Mima, her affectionate name to those who knew her, and her husband Zimri. In genealogy, GS stands for guardianship, and both Zimri and Mima were orphaned. And I don't know if they met through church or how they came to be together, but Zimri was a quiet man, according to his obit. He was from New Hampshire and he was a piano maker. They lived at 54 Main Street in Leominster. Mima, as I've mentioned, was born in 1841. This is 100 years before I was born. She was outgoing, effervescent. Mima married Zimri in 1863, and she was 22 when she married. Now, this is an antique postcard. It's got my mother's writing at the bottom. My origin story would not exist without my mother's handwritten memoir in letter form to her granddaughter, my niece, who is named after her, M.E. Leon. This is, I would estimate, but I'm not really sure because I'm not into antique cars. But I think these cars are like in the 1920s. And this is a picture of the main drag. Leominster, Mass. The trolley tracks are in the foreground. The spreading elm was prominent in the picture. This is the post office. There's a street right here, Merriam Avenue, and if you go up that street, all the early mansions are centered there. And Mr. Merriam was a very prominent businessman, and we'll hear his name later on in the presentation. Here is the generational wealth of my maternal line. This house right here. And the hat shop was built out. It is like a porch. You will see that every other building on Main Street is brick, and some of them, this one in particular, Ellen's department store, is 5 stories high. You could go from 54 Main Street by trolley to Worcester in about 25 minutes. Here is a close-up of Emmy Bowen Millinery Shop. Mima, my great-great-grandmother, is on the left, and her sister, Abby, is on the right. You can see that there were corsets in those days, long dresses, typical of the time. The person in the middle is not identified. Perhaps it was a customer. Here is a close-up of the window in the millinery shop. The hats were decorated with feathers, plumes, bows, flowers. There were different textured hat frames, decorated with ribbons, velvet, silk, satin, and grosgrain ribbons. The curtains form the backdrop. So you probably, most of us are at a certain age where we can remember that hats were a very prominent accessory. Here is the First Baptist Church in Leominster. This Baptist church was built right around the time Mima moved to Leominster, and Mima was among the first members. Church records are a really good source of genealogy information. This is about 1848, circa 1848, right around the time of the Transcendental Movement. We all know Ralph Waldo Emerson's name and Theodore Parker. Here are Mima's daughters. I never knew Aunt Abby, whom my mother spoke of firmly. My great grandmother, Malora Bowen Claflin Corkum is here. She was born on Christmas Day in 1866. I knew her as Grandma Corkum, even though she was my great-grandmother, and I never knew her first name till doing genealogy research in 2023. Grandma's death was very traumatic for me. Uh, she had to have her leg cut off, and she died in a feather bed in my grandmother's house, and the thunder jug was under the bed. And that is when I said to myself, well, she had her leg cut off. I was 16, which is a very tender age. Um, what was the point of cutting off her leg? She died anyway. And I think that formatted my view of death with dignity and not really doing medical procedures to the very end. Here is a picture of Melora Corkum, my great grandmother, and my grandmother as a girl, Helen Corkum Bull, and her brother, Uncle Howard Corkum, and her husband, David Corkum, in the rocking chair in the parlor at 54 Main Street. He was a Leominster police captain. My Uncle Howard grew up to be a Brown graduate and work in Manchester, New Hampshire in the mills. He was a chemist, and he lived in Peterborough, New Hampshire. Also, this old photo is my great-great-grandmother, Melora Corkum. This is her high school picture. And this is Melora's sister, Abby, with her son, Arthur. You can see the attire of the times for young men. And her husband, Owen Casey, and he is in the same rocking chair as was in the parlor at 54 Main Street. Here is this is my mother's writing again. Her mother, Helen, who is my grandmother, and she was like a walking advertisement for Emmy Millinery hat shop. She had this picture hat on, and she's standing by 54 Main Street in her long dress. So she was a walking advertisement for the shop. And here is my great great grandmother, Mima, who is the subject of today's talk. And her hat was a very expensive hat because each feather had a price, and this has many feathers. Mima died when my mother was 9. This is my mother, and she's wearing her own hat, this big bow, which you probably remember, some of you who are at a certain age, that sometimes there would be a person in the elementary school class who wore bows, a different one every day. So this is the back of 54 Main Street, the barn. This is a picture of my family. I'm on the left. It's Easter around 1955. This is my sister Jan and my mother Mara. And my father is taking the picture. And the hats are very important. This hat, I can remember purchasing it. It cost $14.50. And white gloves, of course, were common in the day. And we're in a East Refinery. And this is 3 years before my kid sister, Barbara Hansberry, was born. So there were 3 of us, but I was 17 when Barbara was born. And although it was sort of embarrassing at the time, she has turned out to be my best friend. So now we're going to go back in time. Um, when I'm reading the next section, I want you to imagine uh, that you are actually there and experiencing what I'm talking about in this historical snapshot. My genealogy work has brought me great satisfaction. We stand on the shoulders of those who come before us. Their travel and accomplishments inform us of our past, entertain us, and inspire us in good times and bad. This is my main message. Now we're going to meet Mima and Aunt Sophia and imagine the power of our origins. My great-great-grandmother, Emmy Claflin Bowen, affectionately called Mima by those who loved her, was born in 1841, 100 years before I was born. She was an outgoing and very successful person in a time when women were confined to the home and had no legal standing. But she wouldn't have made such a splash in the pond without her Aunt Sophia Spalding Woodbury, who took her in after Mima's mother, Melora Spalding, and her father, William Claflin of Ashland, died 4 years apart. Mima was 7 when she became an orphan girl. It was 1848. And this was a very masculine world that Mima was living in. Let's take stock, if you'll pardon the pun. Womanhood was regarded as little more than a broodmare, a mare kept for breeding. The second sex had no right. We couldn't run for office. This was obvious because we couldn't vote. Women couldn't get custody of our children and couldn't get a divorce. Women couldn't be productive members of a capitalist society. Women didn't have a voice, and we couldn't plan for our future because we were confined to the home. And we couldn't even make a will. Most important to this origin story was the fact that women, single or married, couldn't own property in 1848 when Mima was orphaned. It wasn't until 1855 that the Women's Property Act was passed in Massachusetts. When both of Mima's parents died, the Claflin farm was sold, and a male guardian, Amos Hawes, was appointed for her big sister, Abby, and herself in 1853. Now, Aunt Sophia, the obvious choice, is overlooked for guardianship. My mother always thought she was the guardian, but she wasn't. This was not surprising, considering the reality of life in the 1840-1850 period. After all, it was a man's world. An orphan child of 7, what future can we envision for Mima? Mima was facing fearful odds. Or to put it another way, she was an orphan in a chilly world. But we must not underestimate Aunt Sophia, who would take Mima in and love her like she was her own child. Their relationship was an example of kinship care at its best. A single woman till age 41, Aunt Sophia married Luke Woodbury, who was twice widowed and said he was 42, but he was actually 57. In 1850 census, Luke was listed as the owner of the house at 54 Main Street, Leominster. The property was valued at $1,000. The couple lived there, and Luke was a bonnet dresser. That is, he decorated hats for a living. Mima and her older sister, Abby, also lived in the 54 Main Street house, and both attended school. As a matter of fact, Mima stayed put at that address for 75 years until she died in 1924. If Aunt Sophia had not paid attention and made a plan when her husband Luke went blind from cataracts and could not work and could not read, if she had not heard about and studied the Women's Property Act and found a loophole that married women could take advantage of, if she had not taken immediate direct action, if Luke had not moved to Bolton to live with his married daughter, named Mary, from his first spouse, Sophia would not have become the owner of 54 Main Street. And Sophia would not have been able, free of the control of her husband, to bequeath the property to Mima when she died in 1867. Ownership gave Mima her start and station in life. When Mima inherited 54 Main Street, she was 27 years old, had a child, and another on the way. Opportunity came knocking, and she opened the door and made a success of M.E. Bowen Millinery Shop. Her husband, Zimri Bowen, was busy building pianos. Meanwhile, Mima was busy building a business in her home at 54 Main Street. And these are the words of my mother, who actually worked in the hat shop starting at age 16. People came from miles around to visit the millinery shop that had 6 large mirrors, and customers could twirl around and use a hand mirror to see the back of the hat they were trying on. There were velvet, satin, silk, and grosgrain ribbons displayed in glass cabinets, and you could decorate your own hat. Feathers, plumes, and bows were displayed in the glass cabinets. The various hat frames also were there to pick from, all different and in different shapes. The trimmers, which is another name for a hat dresser, would decorate the hats in the sewing room according to the customer's taste and specific instructions, and of course, their pocketbook. When Mima died in 1924, she was 82. The house at 54 Main Street was valued at $18,000, and the inventory of the millinery supplies totaled $487,000. The furniture was valued at $200. Mima had Liberty bonds and 2 bank accounts. She was a woman of means. Mima was an entrepreneurial success in an age when most women didn't work. You can't be a full person unless you're out in the world. Mima had status in the community and was a valued member of the First Baptist Church. She was a producer for society. She was a shop proprietor and the mother of 4 children. I know how proud I felt when I bought my own house and crafted a dual career in business and education. It turned out that I was not the first person in my line to do this. Being the main support of my family of 4 was not without precedent. I did not stay put like Mima did, but I inherited Sophia and Mima's spirit. Their story continues to inspire me and make me proud. Although I don't have a closet full of hats, I still decorate myself in my old age. Sophia and Mima were movers and shakers. They pushed boundaries. So do I, as a justice maker. And here is a close-up of the genealogy chart, the tree. Just to go over again, Sophia was born in 1803. She married Luke Woodbury in 1845. Her sister, Melora Spalding, was born a few years later, and she was the mother of Mima, and Melora died when she was only 36. Now, this is a really interesting slide. This is the Registry of Deeds in Worcester. That's where it's found. And this is the Grantor Index from 1840 to 1889. The grantor is the owner, and the grantee is the buyer. You will notice that there are no streets or numbers listed, only the town of the houses. Uh, Here in this column is the book, and the column next to it is the page. We've all heard the term book and page on our mortgages. You can see that the Woodburys, Luke Woodbury's family, was active in real estate. This is a relative. And we go down here to the bottom, in the year is 1845, and we see Sophia Spalding Woodbury as the grantor, the owner of the house that she is supposedly selling to her father, Asaph Spalding. And here's the book and page and Leominster. And also, she owns the house in Holden where she grew up. And she obviously must have been a straw. Those people who know real estate know that someone buys the house in a different name from the actual owner. But this is interesting. Here's a close-up of Sophia's and her father Esau and the Leominster house. We can see that Leominster Savings Bank at one point owned the mortgage, MTG mortgage, on the Leominster house. And this is in 1845, which interestingly enough was the date that Sophia married Luke Woodbury. And it is 10 years before the Women's Property Act was passed. Now, the text of the act is on the right. The index of what is in the writing is on the left. And this is chapter 304 of the Women's Property Act. And you notice it's the married women. I have no idea what you do if you didn't have the status of being married. Um, only this act only applied to married women. And here we see the index. This is kind of blurry. Um, a woman may sue or be sued. May make a will in 1855. A legal document, it could include personal property, like clothing or jewelry, or real property, like real estate. But and the real estate is 54 Main Street, the generational wealth. And a woman can't deprive her husband of more than half of her property. Now, the old way of making sure that what you valued went to your important friends or your relatives, you made a list and hoped to get the item after death. Art, jewelry, clothing, maybe a pet. Um, the husband is not liable for the debts contracted by the wife before marriage. So you know how we hear today about uh, a woman, for example, running up $50,000 in debt for her college education. Her husband would not be liable for that. Uh, so if the woman took out college loans, she would have to repay them herself. In 1855, a woman needs the assent of her husband to buy and sell real estate, except on account of sickness, blindness in Luke's case. So property is not subject to the disposal of the husband, and a woman is not liable for her husband's debts. Husband not liable for debts contracted by his wife before marriage. So, and these laws still exist today. This is really interesting. This is the 1850 federal census. Right here, you can see it's 1850. And you can see that there are 13 lines going across the page. And unfortunately, I don't have a close-up of this, but in 1850, this yellowed out section, um, Luke Woodbury says he's 47, but he really isn't. He's a bonnet dresser. He trims hats. The house is worth 54 Main Street is worth $1,000. Luke was born in Bolton, and his wife, Sophia Woodbury, is not given the dignity of any occupation at all. I mean, she's not even listed as housewife. Uh, and Sophia was born in Leominster. And here's Abby Coughlin, Mima's sister. She's 13 years old in 1850. I'm having trouble getting this over here. So you can see she's 13 years old. She was born in Ashland. And this uh, check here means she's going to school. She's enrolled in school. And here is Myra Elizabeth Claflin, Mima. She's 8 years old, and she too is enrolled in school. And then we see Mary, Luke's 21-year-old daughter from his first marriage. And she's not listed as going to school, but she was born in Bolton, just like her father. Bolton's a suburb of Worcester. Uh, Amos Hawes uh, had guardianship of Mima and her sister Abby, and the sale of the Claflin farm took place in 1856. Um, the farm had been rented out for a few years after the death of Mima's parents. It's kind of interesting. It shows Amos Hawes as the guardian of Mima, only they called her Myra then. And William Claflin was deceased. It says, I will use my best judgment in fixing on the time and place of sale, and I will exert my utmost endeavors to dispose of the same in such a manner as will be most for the advantage of persons herein. Signed by Amos Hawes on November 5th, 1856. And this is the deed of the Claflin farm. And although it's not legible on the slide, it is legible in the hard copy. There were 18 acres of meadow. It was appraised at $666. There was a house and barn, 50 acres of land in Ashland, which is a suburb of Framingham. So not that far from Belmont. And there was personal property such as livestock and implements, of course. There were also sold from the Claflin homestead. Here we see a close-up of the oath. and the judge signing it, and the auction of the Claflin homestead. Here are the guardianship papers of, whoops, of Myra. Sometimes Myra is spelled M-I-R-A, sometimes it's spelled M-Y-R-A in these old documents. And her sister, Abby. Here's the handwritten will of Sophia when she died in 1867. She was like left-handed like I am. The writing slants backwards. Um, it says down here that Myra, who is being bequeathed the property, is the wife of Zimri Bowen. And up here it says, I, Sophia Woodbury, a married woman of Leominster in the county of Worcester, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, being mindful of the uncertainty of human life, of a sound and disposing mind and memory, and being possessed as the owner in my own right of certain real and personal property, and the important words, free from any control of my husband, because of course Luke was blind and had gone to Bolton to live with his daughter Mary. Do make and publish this as my last will and testament, etc., etc. And here's a close-up of the writing slanting backwards. And Myra. It looks like M-E, but that's just the flourish of the writing. Myra E. of Leominster, and her heirs forever will own the property. And here is Sophia's headstone, wife of Luke Woodbury. And I just had this printed out so we could appreciate that Melora Spalding was the mother of Mima, and she died in her 36 years at the age of 36. And her father was William Claflin. I said of Framingham, but actually it was Ashland, a suburb of Framingham. And they had two daughters, Abby and Mima, and there was a brother, William. And so the estate was divided three ways. And here we have the tombstone of Mima when she died in 1924, right here. And we see that her husband Zimri died in 1903, so she was a widow for 21 years. Now, the power of our origins is real and lasting. I'd like to close with the paraphrase of Alan Lightman. Alan Lightman, some of you may know, is a professor at MIT, and he's the first professor from theoretical physics that also is a professor in the humanities. And he's written some really readable books for those of us who are not um, scientifically gifted. And he writes, in my own words, it is kind of comforting to know that we have atoms in the celestial cosmos, past and future, and that these atoms are eternal. They never die. And that's the end.
Well, thank you, Sally, so, so much. It seems you've done an enormous amount of research, and I can see you really enjoyed it and have brought the past to us as we imagined the role of women and the strength in your family. And you should feel just really proud of finding all that. I know there's probably questions that people may want to ask about how you came to all of this information. Um, and before we get to that, I just want to remind people that our November, the second Thursday of every month, is when our Alliance meetings are at 11 o'clock. And our November one will be with Nicole Bernstein, bringing us part two of sections of Paris that we as tourists might be unknown to. And she'll have some rare photos of parts dating back to medieval times to present day. In December, we'll be having a presentation from the group from our church that went on the Camino walk in Spain last May. And in January, we'll be having Lanier Smythe's part two of architecture in Uzbekistan from a wonderful trip that she did. And so that's the beginning of 2025 with more in the works. So I'm going to suggest that if people would like to unmute themselves, if they have questions to ask Sally. Miriam, I see your hands up.
It's a comment. Sally, I don't know if you can page back to the picture of the will, Sophia's will. Sophie's. Yeah, there. This appears to be in a bound volume of wills, which was the official registry with the court. This probably is not the original document that Sophia would have written. This is probably a transcription of that document written by a clerk. And so it wouldn't be Sophia's handwriting. And you might be able to verify that by going and finding this image again and then looking back a couple of pages or forward a couple of pages and seeing if the other wills near it were in the same handwriting.
Thank you, Miriam. That's very interesting. My mother's memoir um, said that it was in her handwriting, but of course, um, I have found other things that were not exactly the same also, so I will check that.
Well, the original will may have been in her handwriting, but this is probably not the original.
I'd like to say that I never would have done this without Miriam's presentation to the Alliance. Up until that time, I had no interest in genealogy at all. And I was riding with Miriam one day in her car. She was giving me a ride to church. And she mentioned Ancestry.com. And it's hard to believe at that point I had no idea what Ancestry.com was. or the other genealogy databases, for example, the New England Historical Genealogy Society has one, and a sub-base of Ancestry is Heritage Quest. And of course, there are lots of things that you come upon once you open up to this idea of finding what happened before you. My sister bought a country house last year, and in the bookcases, there was a 1946 Fitchburg phone book. And I looked in the phone book, and in 1946, my great grandmother, Grandma Corkum, was actually living at 54 Main Street and had a telephone. So this was probably the day when 54 Main Street was sold. And my great grandmother moved into my grandmother's house and spent the last 12 years of her life living with her daughter. So it's pretty interesting that 54 Main Street became a Grant's department store. And it has evolved over the years. It is now Century 21 Real Estate. Are there any other questions or comments? I also would like to say that the historical librarian in Belmont was most helpful, and her name is Logan Manchester, and I never would have put all this together without Logan's help. And it's easy to remember her name because of Logan Airport and Manchester Airport. So if you're ever looking into the past and want help, Logan Manchester is experienced and very good at her work. Of course, local newspapers are very helpful to get the obits. And there was a book in the Belmont Library. It was called Vital Statistics, Leominster Records. And so many of the people in my line were born or married or died in Leominster that Logan actually gave me the book. I have the copy of this record from 1800 to 1850. And I said to her, well, are you sure that it's okay for you to give me the book? And she said, oh, yes, we're digitizing everything, and we don't have room for it anymore. And so now I am now the new owner of that book.
Wonderful. And Sally, it was fun for me to hear some of the names like William Claflin. I mean, Claflin is a Belmont name as well, and it would be kind of fun to know whether any of those relatives were some of the Claflins that were involved in Belmont and of the first church from way back.
Yes, that occurred to me too, and I was very excited about that. I thought I might have a gilded past, but there was a William Claflin. But the William Claflin in my line had a different middle name. So I did check that out. I actually got the historical books. There are about 5 of them that have been written about Belmont, so I learned a lot about my new town. In addition to clarifying that point, that the Claflin family was not related to the Belmont Claflin family.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments to Sally?
Um, yes. Am I on with
We can hear
so?
you. Ken.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Just a side comment going along with everything you have presented. Uh, a few months ago, my best friend died. Uh, he was in his mid-80s and did not leave a will. And because we had been close together, he had somehow it was decided I should be the executor. My advice to everyone listening: make a will. Don't leave without it. It's a terrible burden on an executor to try to guess what it is you really wanted, and then have the state come in and say, "Oh no, we have a better idea."
Hmm.
And you'll have to fight that or whatever. But it's no fun to be an executor.
Good advice, Kenneth.
I just wanted to make one more comment about genealogy and genealogy research. As Sally referred to, going back in history, women really get lost in the records.
Yeah.
Um, beginning with the fact of the name change at marriage. All their records and stuff are with their birth family until they get married. And then the woman changes her name and all the records and stuff switch over to her husband's family. And also that the histories did not focus on the women. And now in genealogy circles, there is, since many of the people doing the research are women, there's much more focus now on going back and recovering the the records and the stories of women in family trees.
So true.
Right, that's what I was doing. And if you, I don't know if I can find it, but I think I can if I go back. Elizabeth Barker in this Tyler book, we don't even know when she died. And her daughter, Elizabeth Tyler, we know when she was born, but we don't know when she died. So women were really swept under the rug. There just wasn't the same emphasis. The military and political history has been going on for centuries, but social history is more recent. And I'm just so glad that I live in a time where women's contributions are appreciated, and we may even have a woman president who was a vice president, and that was always considered the death knell of your political future if you were the vice president. And this is Kamala's opportunity. So you never know. And John Tyler, when he became president after President Harrison died, he was known as the accidental president. Um, the accident of death enabled him to move forward, and the hashtag accidency actually came into the fore. The accidental president, the accidency. So it'll be interesting to see if people who have been vice president do move up into to being elected president in this very important election, which is coming up next month.
Well, we'll all cross our finger that we are on the side that we feel good about, and I am so hopeful that that does come true, Sally. And I want to thank you. I will close with a very tiny story. I love to go through cemeteries and read what's on the tombstones, especially from the ones that are 200 years ago. And there is one of a Ed has a house in West Dennis on the Cape, and there is a very old tombstone. I don't know anything about the person that was there. I forget what her name is, but underneath her name, no date, no anything, underneath her name, it said, "She done what she could." And I know there's a story there. I don't know whether she was 90 years old or whether she was limited in her abilities, but she done what she could, and that's the role of women from 200 years ago. So there's a story there. So thank you, Sally, for bringing us back and knowing how far we as a society have come to recognize our importance in the world, and we will cross our fingers. So I hope to see some of you again in another month when we will have Nicole take us to the hidden parts of Paris, a beautiful, beautiful city. So thank you very much.